A Greek hoplite stands on the deck of a warship off the coast of Asia Minor, and he hears something impossible. A rumor is spreading through the fleet, passed from ship to ship by men who claim they heard it from the gods themselves. The rumor says that on this very morning, hundreds of miles away in mainland Greece, the Persian army has been destroyed at Plataea. The rumor says the war is won, that the invaders are broken, that Greece is saved. No one knows if it is true. There has been no messenger, no signal fire, no possible way for news to travel 300 miles in a matter of hours. And yet every man in the fleet believes it, feels it in his bones, speaks of it as certain fact. You stand on that deck in the late summer of 479 BC, the sun beating down on your bronze helmet, and you look toward the shore where thousands of Persian soldiers wait behind wooden fortifications. In a few hours, you will charge that beach, outnumbered and exposed, attacking an entrenched enemy with no certainty of victory. But right now, in this strange moment of collective belief, you know you cannot lose. The gods have spoken. Plataea has fallen. And today, at a place called Mycale, the Greeks will win again. The Battle of Mycale is the forgotten twin of Plataea, fought on the same legendary day, August 27th, 479 BC, though modern historians debate whether this timing is historical fact or poetic invention. What matters is not the exact date but what the battle represents. Mycale was where the Greeks, having defended their homeland at Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea, went on the offensive. Where they stopped fighting to survive and started fighting to liberate. Where the war that had threatened to destroy Greek civilization transformed into a campaign that would challenge Persian dominance of the eastern Mediterranean. The historian Herodotus, our primary source for these events, writes with the understanding that Mycale marked a turning point, the moment when Persian invincibility, already wounded at Salamis, shattered completely. But to understand why the Greeks were at Mycale at all, you have to go back to the previous autumn, to the aftermath of the great naval victory at Salamis. After Salamis, the Persian king Xerxes had fled back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius with a substantial army to continue the war in Greece. The Persian fleet, badly mauled but not destroyed, had withdrawn to the coast of Asia Minor, to bases in Ionia where they could refit, repair, and wait for the outcome of Mardonius' campaign. If Mardonius won, if he could break Greek unity and force a negotiated settlement, the fleet would return and Persian naval power would be restored. If Mardonius lost, well, the fleet would still be intact, still capable of defending Persian territory and maintaining control over the Ionian Greek cities that had been under Persian rule for decades. It was a sensible strategy, conservative and defensive, designed to preserve assets rather than risk another catastrophic engagement. But it assumed the Greeks would remain on the defensive, would consolidate their victory at Salamis rather than pursue. The Greek fleet, commanded by the Spartan king Leotychidas and the Athenian general Xanthippus, made a different calculation. They had perhaps 110 ships, mostly Athenian triremes with contingents from other cities, a force much smaller than what had fought at Salamis but still formidable. As the naval historian John Hale notes, the decision to pursue the Persian fleet into Asian waters was politically complex and militarily risky. Sparta, the dominant land power in Greece, traditionally showed little interest in naval operations far from home. Athens, which had built the fleet and provided most of the ships, wanted to press the advantage, to liberate the Ionian cities and perhaps establish Athenian influence in the east. The compromise was a joint command, Spartan overall authority with Athenian operational control, an arrangement that worked better than anyone had a right to expect. The fleet sailed east in the spring of 479 BC, island hopping across the Aegean, gathering intelligence about Persian dispositions. What they learned was encouraging. The Persian fleet, numbering approximately 300 ships according to Herodotus, though modern estimates are more conservative at around 200, had beached itself at Mycale on the Ionian coast, near the city of Miletus. The Persian admiral, a man named Mardontes, had apparently lost confidence in his ability to defeat the Greek fleet in open water. Instead of seeking battle, he had pulled his ships ashore, built fortifications around them using ship's timbers and local materials, and waited with his marines and a supporting Persian army of perhaps 60,000 men. The historian Diodorus Siculus, synthesizing earlier sources, suggests that Mardontes believed fortified defense was his best option, that the Greeks would not dare assault a prepared position where Persian numbers would overwhelm them. Leotychides and Xanthippus, approaching Mycale in late summer, faced a difficult decision. They could not attack the Persian fleet while it was beached and fortified, not without suffering catastrophic casualties. They could not simply sail away, that would abandon the entire campaign and waste months of effort. They needed the Persians to come out and fight, or they needed a way to assault the fortifications that did not amount to suicide. The solution came from an unexpected source. As the Greek fleet approached the coast, envoys from Samos, one of the major Ionian islands still under Persian control, rode out to meet them. The Samians brought a message that would change everything. The Ionian Greeks, those cities that had been forced to fight for Persia, were ready to revolt. If the Greek fleet attacked, the Ionians would turn on their Persian masters, would fight alongside their Greek cousins, would help destroy the very fleet they were supposedly defending. You have to understand what this meant, the complexity and danger of the situation. The Ionian Greeks were not Persians. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, traced their ancestry to the same mythological heroes as the Athenians and Spartans. But they had been conquered by Persia 2 generations earlier, had been integrated into the Persian Empire, had fought for Persia at Salamis and other battles. Some had done so reluctantly, waiting for a chance to rebel. Others had accommodated themselves to Persian rule, found it profitable or at least tolerable, saw no reason to risk everything for abstract notions of Greek unity. The historian Peter Green, in his analysis of the Greco-Persian Wars, emphasizes that the Ionian situation was not simply Greeks versus Persians but a civil war within the Greek world, cities and families divided over whether to resist or accommodate imperial power. Leotychides listened to the Samian envoys and saw an opportunity. If the Ionians would revolt, the Persian fortifications would become a trap rather than a defense. The Greek fleet could land marines, assault the walls, and count on internal uprising to break Persian cohesion. It was still risky, still required charging an entrenched position against superior numbers, but it was possible. The Spartan king gave the order. The fleet would attack. They would beach their ships, land hoplites and marines, and storm the Persian camp at Mycale. It would be an amphibious assault, a type of operation the Greeks had little experience with, attacking fortified positions that the Persians had spent months preparing. But the alternative was retreat, and after Salamis, after Thermopylae, after everything the Greeks had endured, retreat was unthinkable. The Persian position at Mycale was strong. Mardontes had chosen his ground well, a stretch of beach backed by low hills, with his ships pulled ashore and surrounded by a wooden palisade reinforced with stone where available. Behind the palisade, Persian infantry was deployed in depth, with the best troops, the so-called immortals and Persian heavy infantry, holding the center. The wings were held by forces from subject peoples, Medes and Bactrians and others, competent soldiers but not the elite. In front of the palisade, obstacles had been placed, sharpened stakes and ditches, anything to slow an assault and give defenders time to shoot down attackers. The military historian Barry Strauss estimates the Persian force at somewhere between 40 and 60,000 men, though ancient sources as always vary wildly. What mattered was that they outnumbered the Greeks significantly. Herodotus suggests the Greek landing force was perhaps 35,000 hoplites and marines, a substantial army but still facing longer odds than the defenders would have preferred. The Greek fleet approached the shore at Mycale in the late morning, rowing in formation, each trireme maintaining its position in the line. From the Persian fortifications, soldiers watched the approaching ships and counted. 110 warships, perhaps more, each carrying marines and hoplites, oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The Persians had numerical superiority and defensive positions, but they also had memory. Memory of Salamis, where a larger Persian fleet had been destroyed in narrow waters. Memory of Marathon, where Persian infantry had been routed by Greek hoplites. Memory that accumulated into doubt, that whispered in the minds of men who were about to be asked to fight and die for an empire that was not theirs. Mardontes, the Persian admiral commanding the defense, understood his vulnerabilities. The Ionian contingents in his force were suspect, their loyalty questionable at best. He could not trust them in the front line, could not give them positions where betrayal would be immediately catastrophic. But he also could not afford to insult them by obviously relegating them to secondary positions that might trigger the very revolt he feared. His solution, as Herodotus describes it, was to disarm the Ionian Greeks entirely, to remove them from the battle line under the pretext of assigning them rearguard duties. The Samians, whose envoys had already contacted the Greek fleet, were sent away from the fortifications entirely, supposedly to guard supplies but really to prevent them from opening gates or attacking from behind. It was a reasonable precaution, but it also revealed Mardontes' lack of confidence in his own forces. An army that cannot trust a third of its soldiers is already half defeated. The Greeks beached their ships in the shallows and began disembarking. This was the vulnerable moment, when men in armor had to wade through surf, climb onto sand, form up under enemy observation. You step off the ship into water that is chest deep, and you feel the weight of your panoply trying to drag you down. Bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, shield, spear, all of it designed for fighting on land, on solid ground where you can brace and push. In the water, you are slow, awkward, exposed. Arrows could come at any moment, javelins, sling stones. The Persians could charge down the beach and catch you while you are still wading, still organizing, still helpless. But they do not charge. They stay behind their fortifications and watch, and that hesitation, that failure to strike when the Greeks are most vulnerable, is the first sign that something is wrong with the Persian defense. The Greeks form up on the beach, arranging themselves by city contingents. The Athenians on the left wing, the Spartans and Peloponnesians on the right, smaller cities filling the center. It takes time, perhaps an hour, to get 10 or 15,000 hoplites organized into proper phalanx formation after an amphibious landing. The Persians watch and do nothing. Herodotus suggests that Mardontes was waiting for the Greeks to attack the fortifications, believing that the obstacles and palisade would break up their formation and allow Persian archers to inflict massive casualties. It was sound defensive thinking, but its surrendered initiative allowed the Greeks to prepare at their own pace, gave time for that strange rumor about Plataea to spread through the Greek ranks. The rumor should not have worked. There was no way for news to travel from central Greece to the Ionian coast in a matter of hours. No messenger could have made the journey, no signal fires could have been visible, no rational explanation existed. And yet, as the military historian Peter Green notes, the psychological effect was enormous. Men who believed they were part of a coordinated double victory, that the gods themselves had ordained Greek triumph on this day, fought with a confidence that transcended tactical calculation. Whether the rumor was divine intervention, as ancient sources suggested, or simply a fortunate coincidence of timing that was later mythologized, the effect was the same. The Greeks believed they would win. Leotychides, the Spartan king, walked along the Greek line before the attack. Ancient sources preserve fragments of the speech he gave, though whether the exact words are accurate or literary invention is impossible to know. He reportedly reminded his soldiers that they were fighting not just for Greece but for freedom itself, that the Ionian Greeks watching from the Persian camp were waiting to be liberated, that victory here would mean the beginning of the end for Persian power in the Aegean. It was a political speech as much as a military one, designed to unify Athenians and Spartans and Corinthians and all the other city-states that traditionally competed and feuded. For this day, for this battle, they would fight as Greeks, not as rival cities. The Athenian general Xanthippus, father of the Pericles who would later dominate Athenian politics, commanded the left wing. He was a veteran of Marathon, had fought in the hoplite line when the Athenians shattered a Persian landing force 15 years earlier. He knew Persian tactics, knew their strengths and weaknesses, knew that Persian infantry were individually skilled but relied on mass archery and cavalry support rather than the grinding close-quarters combat that Greek hoplites excelled at. The Persians at Mycale had no cavalry, the terrain was wrong for it, and their archery would be less effective against hoplites advancing in tight formation with overlapping shields. The Greek advantage was in closing distance, getting into spear range where bronze armor and disciplined formation would overwhelm lighter-armed opponents. The signal for advance came in early afternoon when the sun was high and the heat oppressive. The Greek phalanx began moving forward, not at a run but at the steady, measured pace that kept formation intact. You walk in that formation, and your world narrows to the shield of the man in front of you, the pressure of the man behind you, the rhythm of steps that must stay synchronized or the entire formation collapses. Your shield weighs perhaps 15 pounds, your armor another 40, your spear 8 or 10 pounds of wood and iron. You have been standing in the sun for hours, the bronze heating until it burns to touch, sweat running down your face and back and legs. And now you walk toward fortifications where thousands of enemy soldiers wait to kill you, and you keep walking because the man beside you is walking, because stopping means breaking the line, because this is what hoplites do. The Persians opened fire at perhaps 200 yards. Archers on the palisade, slingers, javelin throwers, all of them loosing at the advancing Greek formation. Arrows arced high and fell among the shields, most deflecting off bronze or wood, some finding gaps, finding flesh. Men fell, crying out or dying silently, and the formation closed around them, gaps filled instantly, the phalanx maintaining its integrity as it had been trained to do. The historian Diodorus Siculus describes the sound of this moment, thousands of projectiles striking shields in a continuous rattle like hail on a roof, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the shouted commands of officers trying to maintain cohesion. At 100 yards, the Greeks paused to dress their lines, to ensure that no gaps had opened, that every shield still overlapped with its neighbor. This was the critical moment, the pause before contact when fear had its last chance to break morale. If men were going to run, it would be now, before the final charge, before the killing started in earnest. No one ran. The Greek line stood solid, shields locked, spears leveled, and then they began the final advance. Not a measured walk anymore but the athismos, the push, the sprint over the last 50 yards that would carry them into the Persian defenses with all the momentum of 10,000 armored men moving as one mass. The Athenian wing on the left reached the fortifications first. They crashed into the wooden palisade, shields slamming against timber, spears stabbing over the top at defenders, the entire formation pushing, trying to break through by sheer physical force. The military historian Victor Davis Hanson, in his analysis of Greek hoplite warfare, emphasizes that this was as much engineering as combat, using human bodies as battering rams, the weight and momentum of the phalanx applied against static defenses. Individual courage mattered, but what really mattered was collective pressure, thousands of men pushing in the same direction, maintaining formation even as they climbed over obstacles and fought hand-to-hand with defenders. The palisade began to give way, timbers cracking, stakes pulling loose from the ground. Athenian hoplites forced their way through gaps, widened them, created breaches. Behind the fortifications, Persian infantry formed up to counterattack, to push the Greeks back before they could establish a foothold inside the camp. But something went wrong for the Persians, something that Mardontes had feared and tried to prevent. The Ionian Greeks, supposedly disarmed and relegated to rear positions, had not stayed disarmed. They had weapons hidden, spears and swords cached in supply wagons, and when they saw the Athenians breaking through the palisade, when they heard the fighting and smelled the blood, they made their choice. They revolted. Not all of them, some Ionian contingents remained neutral or even fought for Persia, but enough. Enough to attack Persian formations from behind, to create chaos in the rear areas, to turn Mardonte's defensive position into a trap. The Persian defense disintegrated in stages, not all at once but in cascading failures that fed on each other. First, the palisade gave way on the Athenian side, breached in multiple places by the sustained pressure of the phalanx. Then the Ionian revolt erupted in the rear, Samian and Miletian soldiers attacking Persian supply lines and command posts. Then the Spartans on the right wing, moving more slowly but with inexorable force, broke through their section of fortifications and began pushing into the camp. Mardontes, trying to coordinate a defense against attacks from 3 directions simultaneously, found his army fragmenting, units losing contact with each other, orders failing to reach their destinations through the chaos. You are inside that chaos if you are a Persian soldier, and your training, your experience, your courage, none of it matters anymore because the situation has become impossible. You are supposed to hold the wall, but the wall is broken. You are supposed to trust the men beside you, but some of them are Ionians who might turn on you at any moment. You are supposed to follow orders from your commanders, but you cannot find your commander in the smoke and confusion, cannot hear commands over the roar of combat. Your instinct, the instinct that keeps soldiers alive, tells you to retreat, to fall back to a secondary position, to find a place where the line can be re-established. But there is no secondary position. The camp is not that large, perhaps a few hundred yards deep, and the Greeks are already inside it, pushing from multiple directions, and retreat means being caught in the open by hoplites whose long spears and heavy shields give them every advantage in close combat. The fighting that followed the breach of the palisade was not organized battle but slaughter on both sides, intimate and vicious. Greek hoplites fought Persian infantry at distances measured in inches, spear thrusts and sword cuts, shields bashing faces, men grappling and stabbing and dying on top of each other. The historian Herodotus, usually economical with details of violence, describes Mycale as particularly brutal, perhaps because it was fought in a confined space where neither side could easily disengage, where every foot of ground had to be won with blood. The Persians, to their credit, did not immediately collapse. The elite units, the immortals, and the Persian heavy infantry that anchored the center, fought with desperate courage, forming defensive squares and holding ground even as the camp fell apart around them. The Athenians, having broken through first, drove deep into the Persian camp, pursuing fleeing soldiers, setting fire to the beached ships that were the whole point of the Persian defensive position. As the military historian John Hale observes, the decision to burn the ships rather than capture them was significant. It meant the Greeks prioritized destroying Persian naval power over acquiring valuable prizes, that this was not a raid for plunder but a strategic operation aimed at permanently crippling Persian ability to project force in the Aegean. Smoke from burning ships darkened the sky, visible for miles along the coast, a signal to every city and island that something definitive was happening at Mycale. The Spartans and Peloponnesians on the right wing advanced more methodically, maintaining formation, pushing the Persian defenders back rather than pursuing them. This was classic Spartan tactics, the slow grinding advance that never broke formation, that never gave the enemy an opening for counterattack. The Spartans had not brought their full army to Mycale. This was not a Spartan priority the way it was for Athens, but the contingent they sent fought with typical efficiency. They killed methodically, professionally, soldiers doing a job rather than seeking glory or revenge, and that cold professionalism was perhaps more terrifying than Athenian fury. Mardontes made his final stand near the beached ships, with perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 Persian soldiers who had maintained cohesion, who still had officers and formation and the will to resist. They formed a defensive circle, shields facing outward, and for a time they held. Greek hoplites crashed against that circle and were repulsed, crashed again and again, taking casualties, making little progress. The Persian defense at this point was suicidal, no hope of victory or escape, just the determination to die expensively, to make the Greeks pay for every foot of ground. Herodotus records that Mardontes himself fought in the front rank, that he killed several Greek soldiers before he was finally brought down by a spear thrust that punched through his armor and into his chest. His death broke the last organized resistance. The Persians who survived threw down their weapons and ran, fleeing toward the hills behind the beach, pursued by Greeks who cut them down from behind. By late afternoon, the Battle of Mycale was over. The Persian camp was a smoking ruin, ships burning, fortifications destroyed, corpses scattered across an area perhaps half a mile long. The Greeks had won a complete victory, destroying not just a fleet but an army, breaking Persian power in Ionia so thoroughly that it would never fully recover. The casualties were asymmetric, as they usually were when hoplites fought lighter-armed opponents in close combat. Herodotus does not give precise numbers, but modern historians estimate Persian losses at perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 killed, including most of the elite units that had formed the core of the defense. Greek casualties were perhaps 2,000 to 3,000, heavy enough that every city that fought would be in mourning, but sustainable, manageable. The Ionian Greeks who had revolted during the battle now faced a choice about their future. They had betrayed Persia, killed Persian soldiers, burned Persian ships. There was no going back, no possibility of reconciliation. They would either be protected by the Greek alliance or they would be destroyed by Persian revenge. The Spartans, whose interests were primarily on the Greek mainland, suggested that the Ionians should abandon their cities and relocate to Greece proper, that defending them against inevitable Persian counterattack was not feasible. The Athenians disagreed. Athens saw an opportunity to expand its influence, to build a network of allied cities in the Aegean that would look to Athens for protection and leadership. The historian Thucydides, writing decades later about the origins of Athenian imperial power, traces it directly to this moment at Mycale, to the decision to protect and incorporate the Ionian cities into what would become the Delian League. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the Greeks consolidating their victory, securing the coast, sending messages to other Ionian cities encouraging them to revolt. The psychological impact of Mycale, combined with the news from Plataea that arrived shortly after and confirmed the rumors that had circulated before the battle, convinced many cities that Persian power was broken, that the time for liberation had come. Across Ionia and the islands, Greek cities rose in revolt, expelled Persian garrisons, declared independence. Not all succeeded. Persia was still a vast empire with enormous resources, but the pattern was set. The Aegean, which had been under Persian control or influence for 2 generations, was returning to Greek dominance. The Persian response to Mycale was delayed but ultimately predictable. Xerxes, who had already lost his fleet at Salamis and his army at Plataea, now lost his naval base in Ionia and his credibility as a military commander. The great invasion that was supposed to add Greece to the Persian Empire had ended in catastrophic failure at multiple levels: strategic, tactical, and psychological. Xerxes would survive as king for another 14 years, but his reputation never recovered. The historian Herodotus, writing with the benefit of hindsight, portrays Xerxes after Mycale as a diminished figure, increasingly withdrawn from military affairs, focused on palace intrigues and building projects, while his generals tried to salvage what they could of Persian power in the Aegean. For the Greeks, Mycale represented transformation. Before this battle, they had been defensive, reactive, fighting to preserve what they had. After Mycale, they went on the offensive, campaigning in Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities, challenging Persian control of the eastern Mediterranean. The military historian Peter Green describes this shift as the moment when the Greco-Persian wars changed character, from an existential conflict over Greek survival to a struggle for regional dominance that would continue for decades. The historian Barry Strauss goes further, arguing that Mycale was the true end of the Persian invasion, more decisive than Salamis or Plataea because it destroyed Persian naval power and opened the way for Greek expansion eastward. But for the men who fought on that beach, these long-term strategic implications were probably invisible. You survive the battle, and what you think about is simpler things. The fact that you are alive when so many are dead. The weight of exhaustion of having fought in armor under the summer sun for hours. The knowledge that your city, your family, is safe, that the Persian threat is diminished, that Greece will survive. The historian Plutarch, in his collection of sayings and anecdotes, preserves a story about a Spartan soldier at Mycale who, when asked how the victory felt, replied that it felt like work. Not glorious, not transcendent, just work that needed doing and had been done. There is truth in that simplicity, in the gap between how we remember battles and how they felt to the men who fought them. The Greek fleet remained at Mycale for several days after the battle, salvaging what could be salvaged, burying their dead, debating what to do next. The Athenians wanted to sail to the Hellespont, to destroy the bridge of boats that Xerxes had used to cross from Asia to Europe, to cut off Persian retreat routes and perhaps trap Persian forces still in Thrace. The Spartans disagreed. They had won, Greece was secure, and extending the campaign deeper into Persian territory seemed unnecessarily risky. The debate revealed tensions that would define Greek politics for the next generation, Athens pushing for aggressive expansion, Sparta preferring consolidation and defense. Eventually a compromise was reached. The fleet would sail north, but cautiously, avoiding major engagements, testing Persian responses. They reached the Hellespont in early autumn and found that Xerxes had already dismantled his bridge, that the Persian king had fled back to Asia months earlier, taking the bulk of his surviving forces with him. The bridge's destruction was both disappointment and relief. Disappointment because it meant no opportunity for another decisive victory, no chance to trap and destroy the remnants of Xerxes' invasion force. Relief because it confirmed what Mycale had suggested, that Persia had abandoned its ambitions in Greece, that the existential threat was over. The Greek fleet, instead of fighting, found itself occupying territory, securing coastlines, negotiating with cities about their future allegiances. War was becoming politics, and not all the Greek commanders were equally skilled at both. The Athenian general Xanthippus led a force to besiege Sestus, a Persian stronghold on the European side of the Hellespont. The siege lasted through autumn and into winter, a grinding operation where the Athenians starved out the garrison rather than assaulting the walls. The historian Herodotus, ending his massive history with the fall of Sestus, treats it as symbolic, the final act of the Persian invasion's defeat, Greeks besieging Persians on what had been Persian-controlled territory. When Sestus fell, when the garrison surrendered and was executed or enslaved, the war that had begun with Xerxes crossing the Hellespont ended with Greeks controlling both sides of the crossing. The symbolism was clear to everyone who understood what had changed. But Mycale's significance extended far beyond the immediate military victory. The battle marked the beginning of what historians call the Delian League, though that name would come later. In the months after Mycale, Athenian diplomats traveled through the Aegean islands and Ionian coast, offering protection in exchange for tribute, building a network of alliances that gave Athens unprecedented influence. The historian Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War begins with an analysis of how Athenian power grew after the Persian Wars, identifies Mycale as the pivot point. Before Mycale, Athens was one important city among many. After Mycale, Athens was becoming an imperial power, using its navy to project force, collect tribute, and dominate the Aegean in ways that would eventually alarm Sparta and lead to the catastrophic war between them. The Persians, for their part, did not abandon the Aegean entirely after Mycale. They still controlled vast territories in Asia Minor, still had resources and armies that dwarfed anything the Greeks could muster. But their approach changed. Instead of direct military confrontation, Persia began using gold and diplomacy, funding Greek factions against each other, exploiting the rivalries between Athens and Sparta and other cities. The military historian Tom Holland, in his Cultural History of the Persian Wars, argues that Persia ultimately won through this indirect approach what it had failed to win through invasion. Greek cities fought each other for the next century, weakening themselves, and Persian gold funded much of that conflict. The Greeks had won their independence, but they spent that independence destroying each other, and Persia profited from the chaos. The soldiers who fought at Mycale returned to cities that were physically damaged but psychologically transformed. Athens, burned by the Persians, was rebuilt larger and more magnificent than before, financed initially by plunder from the Persian Wars and later by tribute from the Delian League. The Parthenon, the symbol of Athenian power and culture that dominates the Acropolis today, was built with money that can be traced directly to the consequences of Mycale. Sparta, which had contributed less to the naval campaigns, found itself increasingly isolated as Athens built its maritime empire. The alliance that had saved Greece at Salamis and Mycale and Plataea began to fracture almost immediately after the common enemy was defeated. You return from Mycale to an Athens that is both familiar and strange. The streets are the same, the landmarks you remember, but there is rubble everywhere. Burned buildings being torn down and rebuilt, refugees still living in temporary shelters. Your family survived the evacuation, but neighbors did not, friends are missing, whole sections of the city feel empty. And yet there is energy, a sense that something new is beginning, that Athens has earned a place at the center of Greek affairs through its sacrifices and its victories. You fought at Marathon as a young man, at Salamis in middle age, at Mycale when you thought you might be too old for campaigning. You have spent half your life at war, and now peace has come, or something like peace, and you do not quite know what to do with it. The generation that fought the Persian Wars became legendary in Greek culture, held up as examples of civic virtue and martial excellence. The playwright Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon and Salamis and possibly Mycale, chose to have his epitaph mention only his military service, not his achievements as one of the great tragedians of the ancient world. He wanted to be remembered as a soldier who had defended Greece, not as an artist or intellectual. That choice reflects something essential about how Greeks of this era understood their identity, defined through collective action, through willingness to fight and die for the city-state, through participation in the great events that had shaped their world. But memory is selective, and commemoration is political. The battles that got monuments and annual remembrances were Thermopylae, Marathon, Salamis, Plataea. Mycale, despite being militarily decisive and strategically crucial, faded into relative obscurity. Perhaps because it was fought in Asia Minor rather than Greece proper, perhaps because it lacked the dramatic desperate last-stand quality of Thermopylae, perhaps because Athenian historians who dominated the narrative preferred to emphasize Salamis where Athens' contribution was most visible. The military historian John Lazenby, in his comprehensive study of the Persian Wars, argues that this historical neglect has distorted our understanding of how the war was won, overemphasizing defensive battles while underplaying the offensive campaigns that actually ended Persian power in the Aegean. The Persian perspective on Mycale, insofar as we can reconstruct it from fragmentary sources, was less about military defeat than about strategic reassessment. Persia had tried to conquer Greece through direct invasion and failed spectacularly, losing armies and fleets and prestige. The empire would survive, would remain the dominant power in the Near East for another century and a half, but its western frontier would never again extend into the Greek mainland. The historian Pierre Briant, in his monumental History of the Persian Empire, emphasizes that Mycale and the other defeats of 479 BC forced a fundamental recalibration of Persian strategic thinking, away from territorial expansion in the west and toward consolidation and internal development. The battle also marked a technological and tactical turning point, though this is less obvious than the political consequences. Greek hoplite warfare, the heavily armored infantry fighting in tight formation, had proven its effectiveness against Persian combined arms tactics across multiple battles. This would influence military development throughout the Mediterranean world for centuries. The military historian Victor Davis Hanson argues that Western military tradition, with its emphasis on decisive battle and heavy infantry, traces directly to the Greek victories over Persia, particularly the amphibious assault at Mycale, which demonstrated that hoplites could operate effectively even in complex terrain without cavalry support. But perhaps the deepest impact of Mycale was psychological and cultural. The Greeks had proven to themselves that they could resist the largest empire in the known world, that their political systems and military traditions could compete with Persian despotism and overwhelming numbers. This self-confidence would fuel the cultural flowering of the 5th century BC, the age of Pericles and Socrates and the great tragedians and historians. The historian Christian Meyer, analyzing the relationship between military victory and cultural achievement, suggests that Greek culture reached its heights precisely because the Persian Wars had given Greeks a sense of historical mission, a belief that their civilization represented something unique and worth defending. Walk the coast near Mycale today, and you find almost nothing to mark where the battle was fought. The shoreline has changed, silted up over 2.5 millennia. The hills behind the beach are quiet, dotted with olive groves and small farms. There are no monuments, no plaques, no tourist infrastructure commemorating the day when 35,000 Greeks stormed a fortified Persian camp and changed the trajectory of Western civilization. Local people know something happened there once, have vague memories of old stories, but the details have faded with centuries of retelling and forgetting. Yet the battle endures in the historical record, preserved by Herodotus and the other ancient historians who understood its significance even if later generations did not. Mycale represents a particular kind of military victory, not the glorious last stand or the brilliant tactical maneuver, but the methodical, professional execution of a risky plan by soldiers who had learned their trade through hard experience. No heroic king died at Mycale the way Leonidas died at Thermopylae. No brilliant tactical innovation won the day the way Themistocle's strategy won at Salamis. Mycale was won by ordinary citizens fighting in formation, maintaining discipline under fire, pushing forward even when the outcome was uncertain, trusting each other and their commanders and the training that had prepared them for exactly this kind of battle. The lessons of Mycale spread quickly through the Greek world, not through formal military academies or written doctrine, those did not exist yet, but through the lived experience of soldiers who had been there, who had seen what worked and what failed. Veterans returned to their cities and trained the next generation, passing on practical knowledge about amphibious operations, about assaulting fortified positions, about the importance of intelligence and the vulnerabilities of multi-ethnic armies whose loyalty could not be assumed. The historian Xenophon, writing a generation later based on conversations with veterans of the Persian Wars, emphasizes that Greek military effectiveness improved dramatically after Mycale precisely because the Greeks had learned they could not simply rely on courage and heavy armor, that they needed coordination, planning, and the willingness to adapt tactics to specific situations. The Ionian cities that had revolted during the battle faced immediate challenges. They had declared independence from Persia, but independence required the ability to defend themselves, and most of these cities were small, wealthy from trade but militarily weak. They needed protection, and Athens was offering it in exchange for ships or money to maintain the fleet that would patrol the Aegean and discourage Persian retaliation. The arrangement seemed reasonable, even generous, at first. Athens would provide security, the Ionians would contribute resources, and together they would maintain the freedom won at such cost. But as the historian Thucydides would later document with bitter precision, alliances between unequal powers tend to evolve into domination, protection becomes control, and contributions become tribute extracted by force. The transformation happened gradually over decades, but its origins are visible in the immediate aftermath of Mycale. Athenian ships that came to protect Ionian cities stayed, established bases, appointed officials to oversee tribute collection. Cities that tried to leave the alliance found themselves besieged by the very fleet that was supposed to protect them. The Delian League, founded on principles of mutual defense and shared sacrifice, became the Athenian Empire, and the seeds of that transformation were planted when Athenian soldiers stormed the beach at Mycale and decided that what they had conquered they would keep. Sparta watched this development with growing concern. The Spartan military system was designed for land warfare, for defending the Peloponnese and maintaining dominance over the Helot population that did all the agricultural work. Naval operations in the Aegean, protecting merchant routes and besieging island cities, these were not Spartan priorities. But as Athens grew wealthier and more powerful through its maritime empire, as Athenian tribute-funded building projects and military expansion, Sparta began to see Athens not as an ally who had helped defeat Persia but as a rival who threatened the balance of power in Greece. The historian Donald Kagan, in his 4-volume History of the Peloponnesian War, traces the origins of that conflict directly to the different strategic choices Athens and Sparta made after Mycale, Athens embracing naval imperialism while Sparta retreated into isolationism. For the individual soldiers who had fought at Mycale, the decades after the battle brought experiences as varied as the Greek world itself. Some became wealthy from plunder and tribute, invested in land or ships, rose in status within their cities. Others returned to poverty, to farms that had been neglected during years of war, to families that had suffered during the evacuation and occupation. The democracy in Athens, strengthened by the role ordinary citizens had played as rowers and marines, expanded political rights and created new opportunities for advancement based on service rather than birth. But democracy also meant demagogues and mob rule and decisions made by masses of people who might prioritize short-term gain over long-term stability. The Athenian politician Pericles, son of Xanthippus who had commanded at Mycale, would spend his career navigating these tensions, trying to maintain democratic ideals while building and managing an empire. The cultural impact of the Persian Wars, and specifically of victories like Mycale that proved Greek military superiority, cannot be overstated. Greek art and literature from the mid-5th century BC is saturated with references to the wars, with pride in what had been achieved, with confidence that Greek civilization represented something superior to Persian despotism or barbarian chaos. The historian Paul Courtledge notes that this cultural confidence had both positive and negative effects, inspiring great works of philosophy and drama while also fostering the arrogance and overreach that would eventually lead to disaster in Sicily and the loss of the Peloponnesian War. The Greeks learned from Mycale that they could defeat any enemy, but they did not learn when to stop fighting. The Persian Empire, meanwhile, adapted to the new reality. The satrapy system, the provincial governance structure that allowed considerable local autonomy, remained effective at integrating diverse populations despite the military setbacks. Persian gold continued to flow into Greek politics, bribing politicians, funding factions, exploiting the divisions that Mycale had temporarily overcome. The military historian Tom Holland makes the provocative argument that Persia ultimately achieved through Greek disunity what it had failed to achieve through conquest, a western frontier where Greek cities were too busy fighting each other to threaten Persian interests. Whether this was deliberate strategy or fortunate accident, the result was the same. The Greek world that had united against Xerxes tore itself apart within 2 generations. For the families of those who died at Mycale, the victory was cold comfort. The battle had been won, Greece was safe, but fathers and sons and brothers were still dead, buried in mass graves on a foreign shore or lost in the sea or cremated in Persian fires. The historian Herodotus, normally focused on great men and decisive moments, occasionally pauses to acknowledge these ordinary losses, the widows and orphans created by every battle, the households that would never recover from the absence of men who would never come home. Ancient societies accepted military casualties as inevitable, built rituals and monuments to honor the dead, but acceptance did not mean the grief was less real or the losses less painful. The veterans who survived Mycale carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of the battle frequently, turned it into stories that grew in the telling, became known in their cities as the men who had been there when history changed. Others rarely mentioned it, found that words could not capture what combat felt like, that people who had not experienced it could not truly understand. The playwright Aeschylus, transforming his memories of Salamis and possibly Mycale into drama, found a way to communicate the experience through poetry and performance, to give audiences some sense of what the soldiers had felt. But even his plays, powerful as they were, could only approximate the reality, could only gesture toward the complexity of fear and courage and violence and exhaustion that defined combat in the ancient world. The monuments that were eventually erected to commemorate the Persian wars mostly focused on Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. Mycale received less attention, perhaps because it was fought in Asia Minor rather than Greece proper, perhaps because amphibious assaults lacked the dramatic simplicity of land battles or naval engagements. But the men who fought there knew what they had accomplished, knew that without Mycale the war might have continued for years, that Persian naval power might have recovered, that the Ionian cities might have remained under Persian control indefinitely. They did not need monuments to validate their service. They had each other, the bonds formed through shared danger, the knowledge that they had done what needed doing when it mattered most. As decades passed and the generation that fought the Persian wars aged and died, the memory of Mycale faded from popular consciousness while remaining preserved in historical texts. Herodotus ensured that the basic facts survived, though his account is frustratingly brief on tactical details. Later historians like Diodorus and Plutarch added fragments and anecdotes, creating a composite picture that is incomplete but sufficient to understand the battle's broad contours. Modern archaeology has contributed little. The battlefield has been built over and altered by centuries of coastal erosion, but textual analysis and comparative military history allow reasonably confident reconstruction of what happened on that August day in 479 BC. The ultimate significance of Mycale lies not in any single innovation or heroic moment but in what it represented about Greek civilization at a crucial juncture. The Greeks had been invaded by the largest empire on earth, had seen their cities burned and their people displaced, had faced enemies who outnumbered them and commanded resources they could not match. They could have surrendered, could have accepted Persian rule, could have accommodated themselves to conquest the way dozens of other peoples had done. Instead they fought, not once but repeatedly, at Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea and Mycale, and through courage and skill and luck and the willingness to risk everything, they won. That victory, purchased at enormous cost, gave Western civilization the space to develop along its particular trajectory, created the conditions for Greek philosophy and drama and democratic experimentation that would influence human thought for millennia. You cannot visit Mycale today and feel the ghosts of that battle the way you can sometimes feel history at preserved battlefields. The coast is quiet, developed, ordinary. Tourists pass through on their way to more famous sites, unaware that something world-changing happened here. But the battle endures in memory and text, in the histories that preserved it and the analysis that continues to examine it, in the recognition that small forces fighting on the right ground with the right tactics can defeat larger opponents, that free men defending their homes fight with advantages that no amount of imperial power can fully overcome. Mycale was where the Greeks, having survived the Persian invasion, began building the future that would eventually become our past. On a beach in Ionia, armed with bronze and wood and the willingness to die for something larger than themselves, ordinary citizens of rival cities stood together and changed the world.